call this our classroom. And I'm so impressed by how quietly and diligently you all walked in this morning. Hopefully, we will get lively this morning. I am Margaret Lowe Smith. I'm president of Atlantic Live, and I want to welcome you to this Atlantic Exchange on this cold January morning for a conversation with Virginia Congressman Bob Goodlatte, chair of the House Judiciary Committee. As we all know, tonight, President Obama will give his final State of the Union address. The White House has promised us a big picture speech that will skip the usual legislative wish list. One topic that he will no doubt address is criminal justice reform, a matter that has captured the political limelight, the attention of Congress, and where there is rare bipartisan agreement. The need to solve the problem of excessive jail time for nonviolent drug offenses. Congressman Goodlatte has been leading the push to reduce prison terms and mandatory minimum sentences for some drug offenses. He's here with us this morning to talk about that and more with the Atlantic Steve Clemons, Washington editor at large. They're coming in for the conversation. Feel free to tweet about this morning at Atlantic_live and use the hashtag ATLX. Good morning, Congressman. Welcome, Congressman Goodlatte and Steve Clemons. Take it away.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. These chairs are kind of ridiculous because if you've got to kneel down and get your water, it's way down there. But we won't tape that part. I want to say hello to all of you. Good morning, and we'll rile it up this morning. Today is the day of the president's last State of the Union address, and some of the subjects we'll be talking today are going to also be reflected upon by the president, I'm sure. So, Mr. Chairman, I know you've been focusing a lot on criminal justice reform, and you're marking up a few bills today, in fact, in this arena. But I'd love to kind of just start with your own survey of what do you think is converging right now to make this a unique moment where both parties are beginning to seemingly get in the same circle on criminal justice reform?
Well, I think, first of all, we haven't had a comprehensive review of our criminal justice system and our criminal justice laws in several decades. So it's appropriate periodically to take a look at that and to ask oneself what needs to be done in terms of making sure that sentences are fair, what needs to be done to make sure that people coming out of prison don't commit crimes and go through a revolving door and right back into prison. I think the issues with new technology that have made it possible to determine better whether or not someone has committed certain types of crimes, has increased awareness of the need to make sure that innocent people don't go to prison in the first place. I believe there has been widespread attention paid to the issue of civil asset forfeiture, where people's assets are seized by law enforcement, and then under certain circumstances where they're not even charged with a crime, it's very difficult for them to get their property back.
Huge amount of money.
It's a lot of money. That's actually become an issue because the administration has stepped in and made some reforms to the civil asset forfeiture laws with regard to the federal government and under what circumstances states can participate. Certain funds that were going to law enforcement have been reappropriated for other purposes. So law enforcement is saying we can no longer participate in drug task force, regional task force, for example, because we don't have the resources to put our personnel into the picture. We don't want that to happen. We want the cooperation between federal, state, and local law enforcement to continue. So that issue is one on the table for us, but it's one that's has some complexities attached to it. And we want to make sure that with now more than 5,000 federal criminal statutes and hundreds of thousands of regulations in which criminal penalties can be imposed, jail time can be imposed, that people actually know that they're violating a law and that they have a criminal intent, or what's called mens rea. Mm-hmm. All of these are things that have risen in the public awareness, coupled with some of the issues with regard to policing. We're aware of incidents around the country where police have used force in circumstances that have been controversial, but we're also aware of the dedicated police officers across the country who are the targets and who are more often the victims of attacks. We saw one just a few days ago in Philadelphia where a person was attacked and shot, and the brave police officer got out of the car and after you've been wounded and track the person down. But these kind of things, in my opinion, call for the public to pay attention to this, and therefore the Congress to pay attention to this, and to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to improve our criminal justice system. And I think it's a good opportunity because there's strong bipartisan support. The President and the Congress, the House and the Senate are all at work on this.
You know, I went back and I looked at the sort of, I guess, the historical legacy of tough drug laws, and went back to Nelson Rockefeller, and you said a lot of these laws haven't been revised in decades, and looked at what he signed in New York in 1973, which set a very standard and almost became a kind of binary question. You were either a law and order candidate or you were in favor of the criminals. And the law and order candidate wouldn't be introspective about forfeitures and DNA evidence. A lot of the things that you're saying is just this moment of introspection has really changed. Why do you think it took decades to get to where we are now?
Well, I don't know the answer to that other than to say that we have a system that in many respects works well, but it's always in need of a careful checkup, a tune-up, if you will. And in addition, we know that we have a very large prison population in the United States. Most of that is at the state and local level, not at the federal level, but the federal prisons are extensive. So asking a question about, is this the best way to handle some people who go outside the law in every instance, or are there other alternatives to make sure that they obey the law and that they don't go back to a life of crime once they have been dealt with, calls for a review of how our prison system works and how our sentencing system works as well.
Now, you and I have talked about this subject before, and I've talked to Rand Paul and Cory Booker, and I know that the concern for criminal justice reform is pervasive. One of the big players in this debate right now, you just read about them every day and how close they're getting to Valerie Jarrett, is the Koch Industries, and it's sort of a remarkable moment. And I guess my question is, do you think Koch Industries has itself as a player in this created the space so that more in the GOP can move on it? Or do you think, absent Koch, this reform might not be happening?
No, I think this reform would be happening regardless of whether Koch's interested. There are many other conservative groups and organizations that are interested in aspects of criminal justice reform, or taking a look at all of these areas of criminal justice reform. So I'm pleased that they and a lot of other people are interested in this issue, but it's one that is pervasive in our society. We have found a number of states, in fact some are rather surprising states, like Texas, where they've done some criminal justice reform. They have reduced their prison population, and prison populations are very costly to the taxpayers as well as to the lives of the people who are in prison. But they've reduced their prison populations. At the same time, they've reduced their recidivism rates of those people who are getting out of prison. So we felt that these states, Georgia's another, had something to inform us of. So as a part of our effort here, which has been going on now for 3 years, when I became chairman, I created a over-criminalization of federal law task force, bipartisan, chaired by Jim Sensenbrenner, vice-chaired by Bobby Scott, even numbers on both sides, and they spent a year, or 2 years actually, holding a series of hearings and came back with recommendations. One of those hearings was to bring in representatives, elected officials, prison officials, and so on, from those states where they've had this success, to see if we could learn something from it. Now, states' criminal laws and who's in state prisons is often quite different than who is in federal prisons. Federal prisons generally hold the toughest, most serious criminals. So what we can do to reform may be different than what they can do to reform, but we still felt we could learn from that.
Now, tonight you're going to be at the State of the Union address, right?
Absolutely.
And you're going to be there with Debbie Dingell, Representative Debbie Dingell, who's here. Anybody else hiding out as a congressperson I haven't seen here? So you two are going to get the special seats tonight, so it's great to see Debbie here today. And I'm interested, when the president begins talking about criminal justice reform, which we know he will, are you going to see most of your caucus stand up and applaud?
I believe that there is wide bipartisan support for this. We've already passed several bills out of the Judiciary Committee on a very bipartisan basis. From day one, John Conyers, a fellow Michigander with Debbie, who is the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, and I have worked very closely to make sure that everything we do in this area has bipartisan support.
Are you teaching other committees how to do this?
Well, we're learning ourselves. We hope others will emulate it. But we've also had success in other areas. For example, the USA Freedom Act, which both raised the protection of American civil liberties and made sure that we continue to be safe from terrorist attacks by having law enforcement and intelligence agencies able to gather properly the information that they need, was another very successful bipartisan effort by the Judiciary Committee. So we have some practice in this, but this is very large and very extensive. There'll be a dozen or more bills by the time we're done in the 5 areas that I described earlier. I believe that this has support in our leadership. I believe it has support in the Democratic leadership, and I think it has support amongst many members of Congress who hear about it back home. Now, not everybody agrees on this subject. Many people in law enforcement are looking at this very carefully. They want to see criminal justice reform, but they have a view of it that might be different than somebody else's view. And we want to take all of that into account. But so far, we have been very successful at holding together in a bipartisan fashion. We want to keep it that way.
So I've noticed of late the Republican Party is having a tough time coming up with a presumptive presidential candidate, at least thus far. And I, possibly any of you might be president. And if you were to become president of the United States, and say in 2018, when you were giving your State of the Union address, would you have an empty seat next to your spouse for victims of gun violence?
I would have, by that time, done a lot more than President Obama has done to enforce our current gun laws. And this is so much undercovered by
You've actually
the media.
said that enforcements are down 30%.
Yes, they are.
In this period, and
They
you're
are.
blaming the president for that. So I actually technically don't know the answer to this question. What role does the President of the United States play in the relative enforcement or non-enforcement of those gun laws?
President of the United States is the chief executive officer of the United States. Every government department and agency is under his leadership, including the Department of Justice and the 94 U.S. attorneys' offices all across the country. But to just give you one example, out of that 30%, that includes crimes for using a gun in the commission of a crime. It includes gun purchase crimes, like you have a felony conviction,
Right.
You can't purchase a firearm, so you get a friend or a family member to purchase the gun.
As
and
we
they
saw in San
turn it over to you.
Bernardino.
Right. That's called a straw purchaser. And in the last year, for which we have all the numbers, 76,000 people went to a gun store or any licensed firearm dealer online or at a gun show, wherever they went, and bought and filled out a form to buy a firearm. 76,000 lied on that form, put down false information, said they didn't have a felony conviction when they did, said they didn't have a mental health commitment when they did. Of those, the FBI referred 5,000 to those 94 U.S. attorneys' offices for prosecution. And out of the 76,000, only 62 were prosecuted. So that means that someone who is prohibited from buying a gun knows that if they go to a gun dealer to buy a gun, and even if they get caught, like these people did, the odds are less than 1 in 1,000 that they'll be prosecuted. So I believe that we need to do more work in mental health. I've co-sponsored, for example, Tim Murphy's bill dealing with getting attention paid to making sure people in mental health crises get help quickly. I believe in
Do you support what the president is putting on the table on mental health?
I support what Congressman Murphy has put forward. I have not had the opportunity to study everything the president is proposing, but I do believe we need to do work in the mental health area. And I do believe that we need to encourage employers, for example, to share with subsequent employees who have engaged in violent behavior or threatening behavior. Right now, too many employers are told by their lawyers, name, rank, and serial number. That's all the information you should share. So I'm going to introduce legislation that will deal with creating a safe harbor to make sure that when it comes to violent behavior, employers are encouraged rather than discouraged to let the next employer down the line know that this person needs mental health services and not necessarily a job in their business. I've had
It's really
experience with that.
interesting that the gun debate seems to be dominated right now by the conversation between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton rather than in the GOP. I don't know why that is, but that's my impression. And over manufacturing liability, I'm wondering where you think the line ought to be drawn on manufacturer's liability.
Well, the
in
focus
this
should
debate.
be on the behavior of people who misuse guns, not on the gun itself.
But
Because
I think part of the manufacturing liability is not about it's manufacturers sending. The question, as I understand the line, is manufacturers sending great number of guns in places with a knowledge that those guns aren't being used for sort of individual consumption, but are going to other nefarious groups.
well, again,
just by way of
well, that
export
gets
sale.
back to our topic of criminal justice reform, right? If you can show that they have the
Criminality,
intent
right.
to provide firearms to people who are not lawfully entitled to have firearms, then that's a violation of the law right now, and the law should be enforced. But that again relates to the issue of enforcing the law, and I believe that if the president is truly serious about this, rather than each time we have one of these horrific incidences, deflecting that attention back to the Congress. Well, we need more laws. We have hundreds of gun control laws at the federal level, thousands at the state level, and the president should start with enforcing those laws. That is the reason why those laws exist, to stop people who should not have firearms from getting them and to punish them when they get them and misuse them.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have read, you've both stated and written some very compelling things about what you see as a breakdown of trust about policing. When you look at Baltimore, Ferguson, Chicago, some of the things that we've seen play out, horror playing out vividly in car cameras and whatnot. And you have a worry about this disintegration of trust. And I'm interested in how you think, people are losing confidence, particularly members of the African American community who are also part of the over-incarcerated population, who also are part of the group that have been paying exorbitant fees. What do you think is a roadmap or a playbook to getting back into a trust formula given these horrendous problems that we're seeing, and not only just a couple of cities, but all throughout the United States?
I think we're in communities where you have elected officials and the leaders of law enforcement agencies, the chiefs of police and so on, who are committed to engaging the community in a discussion about this. They're taking the first step in terms of rebuilding trust. It's so important that they have those communications, because the greatest victims of the kind of violence that police officers are trying to prevent and sometimes get caught up in are the people in the communities that are the most upset about this. So having that dialogue and having that understanding and building an appreciation for how law enforcement can do good things in those communities and make those communities better places to live and work and raise a family is a big part of this. So encouraging that, I think, is number one. In addition, I think it's important that law enforcement at every level recognize that they have an ongoing responsibility for professionalism. So what we can do to incentivize police departments, large and small, and other law enforcement agencies to make sure that their officers are regularly trained in all of the aspects of their job and understand how to do them better, and to handle these very difficult situations in the best way possible is the best way to avoid these circumstances. I believe the overwhelming majority of law enforcement agents, of police officers around this country, are dedicated, professional people who do the right thing time in and time out. And they are given a bad name by a very, very, very small number. And in the process, we should not overlook the fact that law enforcement agents, in protecting all of us, put their lives on the line, and far more of them have lost their lives due to these kind of violent incidences than the there's several of them, but still a small number of cases where a law enforcement officer may not have done the right thing with regard to a particular circumstance, and a tragedy ensued from that. That's bad. We should be doing what we can to stop it, but we should also recognize the importance that law enforcement be given the support and the training and the resources to do the job they need to do to keep all of us safe.
You know, coincidentally, the day before the Chicago Police Department put out the video of the young man being killed with a lot of police officers coming around, Rahm Emanuel made a very similar statement. He talked about the volunteerism of police and communities and gave a very, very similar statement. But when you go back and look at that, one of the big controversies was just the feeling that the police department had tried to stack the deck, tried to prevent the release of information, had waited over a year with that video, and then there were other videos that have come up. And so part of the concern when you get down to the question of trust is that when it comes to a point of crisis, that people feel, and you can say make the same case in forfeitures about getting your assets back that have been wrongly taken, that the system is self-perpetuating and self-protecting. Is there something that needs to happen in that to get trust back in place?
Well, we have a system of rooting out wrongdoing and promoting justice. That is basically a good system. We need to review it periodically. And local governments and state governments need to do that as well to make sure that there is not the wrong mindset or there is not corruption in various aspects of government. But that should not deter us from the recognition that the vast majority of communities and the vast majority of law enforcement officers in every community are good, well-intentioned people. When something goes wrong, you need to identify it, you need to fix it, and you need to bring that out and make it public and subject it to the kind of criticism that people don't like to see, but nonetheless needs to be a part of the process so that people learn from it and don't do it again. So covering up information about a particular investigation or a particular tragedy is not a good thing, and we should promote that too.
I want to compliment your website. I went to the House Judiciary website. I don't know if your web people are here.
They're here.
Yeah, it's a great website. Lots of information. Your personal website is great. We talked last time about your son being such a great IT guy. His son retired like at 28 years old after being a Facebook gamer genius or something. But I respect people with great
something
websites.
like that, but
yeah,
not quite.
Yeah, something along those lines. Yeah, it was really interesting. But the website conveys a lot in these areas of criminal justice in detail and with depth. And there's a young man named Radley Balco who wrote for the Washington Post that he went to look at what the various candidates, particularly in the GOP, but in both parties, had to say about criminal justice. And it's fascinating. The gap between your website and anyone running for president of the United States is really astounding in terms of what. So we're talking about criminal justice tonight, president reform. The president will be talking about criminal justice reform tonight. But it doesn't seem to have percolated very deeply, at least into the campaign material, with the exception of Rand Paul and Martin O'Malley. And I'm interested in why you think that is. Why isn't this a greater, something that they feel that they need to make an anchor of their presidential ambitions?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on why
come
a
on.
particular candidate is doing, but I will say
How about
that
Donald Trump?
The material on our website is not copyrighted, and
Yeah.
they are all welcome to come and avail themselves of that information.
And that's a tweetable line that
and
Donald
use
Trump,
it-
everyone's,
and
can
use it
avail
in a
themselves.
positive way to promote criminal justice reform.
Donald Trump and Ted Cruz are out there. If you were to sort of look at those two, I guess Marco Rubio in some polls, but if you were to look at the top 2 or 3 candidates in the GOP and how they're approaching this question of rebuilding trust in policing, in criminal justice, in dealing with it, how would you, and you can do the same thing with the president, how would you, in a kind of nonpartisan way, grade them, if you were, in terms of what they're getting right and what they're getting wrong?
Not going to do that either, but I will just say in general that I think this is an issue that the public is very interested in. It relates to some of the broader issues that some of the candidates on both sides, by the way, but some of them have tapped into, and that is mistrust of government. And I think the fair thing to say is we know there are people out there who are going to commit crimes today. We want to stop them from doing that. The ones who do it, we want to make sure they are appropriately punished. And when we're finished punishing them, we want to make sure they become good citizens and don't go back to a life of crime. That's an issue for every American, and I think every presidential candidate should tap into it. But one of the things the public has, because of these various issues that you've described here related to civil asset forfeiture or crimes against police or crimes by a few police or issues of people staying in prison for extraordinarily long times when they get out they're in their 70s, and long ago they probably were past the point where they ever would have committed another crime. All of those things, I think, tap into the public's mistrust of, is government getting it right? The best way to try to, for elected officials, members of Congress, candidates for president, to reinstill public confidence is to look at these issues, address them, and try to get them right. So this is a perfect issue for the presidential campaign.
When you heard about the Bundys and their advocates taking over this national wildlife site in Oregon, and the complexities of that, because part of it touches mandatory sentencing issues and how these folks get described in the national. Did you just wake up and take a couple of Tylenol, or do you feel as if the metaphor that they're providing right now is one that helps us sort through some of these other challenges about people's relationship to justice?
Well, I think it is a case that's worth looking at prospectively as we move forward, because on the one hand you have a whole background of the people involved in this that I'm not very well informed about, and then you have the facts of the actual crime that they have been convicted of, and you have a difference of opinion between the district court judge and the Circuit Court of Appeals. This may wind up ultimately going to the Supreme Court. I don't know where it will, but I will say this.
But these folks got, regardless, they have guns and took over a federal facility.
Oh, well, I'm not defending that action whatsoever, but the underlying issue for which the fire that went across the line and into the federal lands raises all kinds of issues that are important to look at with regard to criminal intent, and these are people of
This mens rea. How do you pronounce it?
criminal intent, or mens rea.
Mens rea.
And it involves a famous sports car driver who got caught in a blizzard and wound up lost in a wilderness area, and it took him a couple days to find him and get him out and rescue him. And when they did, they charged him with operating a motorized vehicle in a wilderness area.
Huh.
He had no criminal intent whatsoever. He got lost in a blizzard. So is there a fine or something like that for not following some rules? Fine. But when you have hundreds of thousands of government regulations and now 5,000 separate distinct federal criminal statutes, the ones that are founded in the common law, like murder and rape and robbery, there it's presumed that people know
Which side of the line?
Right. You don't have to show criminal intent there. But when you have hundreds of thousands of government-created laws and regulations, and people, there's nobody who knows what all of those laws are. So all of us are subject to violating laws. We don't have any idea we're going to be violating them. And so in those instances,
Kind of how Russia used to work.
one of the
right?
elements of a crime historically is to show criminal intent. And I think that is an important part of this discussion. Now, it has been carefully worked on in the House Judiciary Committee. We passed out a bill in a bipartisan fashion, and just like
So explain it to us.
let me finish
'cause
though.
yeah.
Just like Ranking Member, former Chairman Conyers, and I have agreed on bills that have passed out on sentencing reform. We're working right now on one dealing with prison reform. We also agree that addressing this issue in a bipartisan fashion of requiring the showing of criminal intent in appropriate circumstances is a part of doing justice, a part of making sure that people are prosecuted fairly and that there's confidence in the system. Now, I can't comment on all the ramifications of that particular case other than to say that if the underlying laws are made clear, that if there is a requirement of showing of criminal intent, then if you're burning brush and the wind blows the fire across the line into the forest and you didn't intend that, that may be an issue to look at. On the other hand, if there's some other element to this that I'm not familiar with that says that they knew and they know that taking possession of government property is not appropriate, and that is a different criminal intent. There's lots of different ramifications to that particular case, so I don't want to pass judgment on that when the courts are already divided on the subject. I'm just saying that looking ahead, we build greater trust in our system when if government's going to have as many laws and regulations where criminal penalties can be imposed, that citizens of all walks of life need to have trust that their government is not going to misuse those laws and regulations in ways that are unfair. And one way to avoid unfairness is to say, you want to fine them for something, great. But if you're going to incarcerate them, if you're going to put them in prison or in jail, you got to show they had a criminal intent.
Right now, where the needle where that needle is with the White House, I think is not ready to move forward on this sort of mens rea move. And as I understand it, many on the left view this as a backdoor to letting people off for environmental damage and culpability and food tainting and other kinds of consumer or environmental issues. Do you think that that's something that's overcomable in your negotiations and discussions with the White House?
Not only do I think it's overcomable, but I also think it has to be overcome because this is a critical element to doing justice in this country. And it affects people of all walks of life. It does affect people in business. It could affect a business that violates an environmental law. It does not change the fact that if you violate environmental law, you're going to be subject to fines. And if you deliberately violate an environmental law, you would still be subject to prison time for that. And if the statute is clear in what it requires of criminal intent, then that's covered. But in most instances, the regulations that are written to control behavior, and then they add in, by the way, if you don't behave the way we want you to behave, we're also going to impose criminal penalties. Most of them are absolutely silent on the issue of intent. And we believe that absent specific language regarding that, or absent an area of the law where it's clear that it's what's called malum in se, or common law criminal activity, as opposed to malum prohibitum, which is all these laws and regulations passed by government. Absent those things, the government should be required to show intent, not for each element of the crime, but intent to take the action and violate the law.
So would you oppose a deal on criminal justice reform that did not include that package?
I think that a deal that does not address this issue is not going anywhere in the House of Representatives.
Interesting. That's a profound comment. Today you're marking up 3 bills, is why you've got a hard stop here just in a little bit, but you've got a bill on mental health, one on it's called the Second Chance Act that I know Jim Sensenbrenner has put forward, and a third on a no-fly list. So give us a snapshot of the 3 pieces of legislation.
Well, the Second Chance Act is, as it sounds, intended to make sure that people coming out of prison are getting an opportunity to be ready to take up a life that will be more fulfilling and will not involve a life of crime. So making sure that they get vocational opportunities, academic opportunities in prison is what the Second Chance Act is all about. The second one, dealing with mental health, is to make sure that we are doing a better job of getting mental health services to people in prison. Because one of the things, one of the reasons why we need to do criminal justice reform is that our society has evolved in terms of not taking people who are suffering from serious mental health problems and putting them in mental health institutions. We have fewer and fewer of those and fewer and fewer beds. In some instances, we need to make sure that there are facilities available for people in crisis that are not prisons, but that's a separate issue. But the issue that we have to deal with here right now is that in the criminal system, particularly the federal criminal system, because that's what the Congress has jurisdiction over, people who are committing crimes are in many instances people who have serious mental health problems. So when they get to prison, that can be a place to exacerbate their mental health difficulties, which does not improve their circumstances when they're ultimately released, or they can get some help with the problem so that they're better able to handle it when they get out. That's the purpose of Congressman Collins' bill, which we'll mark up in the committee today. And then Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has raised questions about the no-fly list, and which is a subset of the wider terrorist watch list. And we want to, and we think she has a good idea, and this is, again, I think a very bipartisan approach. We want to have an audit of that because there are people who are on those lists who shouldn't be on there. And we want
Their life is screwed if they're on the list and shouldn't be on there. It's
we
very
want to
hard.
make it easier to figure out who shouldn't be on there and easier for those people to get off of those lists. So that way the list becomes more valuable, right? Because you know you really are looking at somebody who you should be taking great precautions about, as opposed to somebody who's been put on in random. And there are several members of Congress, and to my knowledge, no reason for them to be on the no-fly list, but who found themselves on that list, some current and former members. So the problem is that those lists are created not through a due process system where people have been adjudicated and found to be in such a state that they need to be on the list. They're based upon hunches, they're based upon information that may be accurate or inaccurate, and they're useful tools, but we shouldn't overestimate their usefulness, and we should make sure that people who are unfairly put on them have a better way of getting off. I think her request of a GAO study of this very point is a good one, and we'll support that today.
I want to move to the audience just a moment, but just finally I'm going to ask kind of a cosmic question. You're the most powerful law and order person in the House of Representatives, and I imagine you meet lots of judges, lots of chiefs of police, lots of people in the system. And in talking about mental health and looking at that equation, and you just said, hey, we're not going to solve, X problem. We're trying to take, some stake in the issue of what's in the prisons. It seems to me there are two arenas where you've got a bias built into the system where you're taking, mentally health challenged people, and we're not solving them outside the prison community, and they're finding their way into prisons, which is a big problem we hardly discuss. And the second that I hear a lot about, particularly from urban cities, is the school to prison pipeline, and judges who say we have to intervene and not get kids into a fast track, into an experience that actually creates a self-fulfilling outcome that they become prisoners. And I'm interested in your contact and interaction with most of the people in this profession. Do you find them ready to shift? Because when you look at the marketplace of what's happening, bad things are happening, and you're trying to fix that. But if you've got people who have a bias built in how they see the crime problem, and the school to prison pipeline is not a problem for them, how do you undo that? I guess it's a sociological question I'm asking you, and a psychological question. How do you change the mindset of people who've grown very used to performing in a way, and you're actually trying to change that?
Well, in many instances, you don't need to change the mindset because prison officials, law enforcement officials, they recognize this problem. They understand it. And quite frankly, the less they have to deal with it, the better they would like it. So they would, and also I don't want to suggest that we're dealing with this problem in a vacuum. We're not. I just don't have jurisdiction over mental health institutions in the Judiciary Committee, but I've, as I said earlier, co-sponsored Tim Murphy's legislation. He's a mental health professional, and he has a lot of good ideas about how you intercept these people and make sure they get help before they ever find themselves in the criminal justice system, or even when they do get into the criminal justice system, they're diverted into something that's going to be more helpful to them than imprisonment in some instances. So I think that the people who are most closely involved with this are the most interested in finding solutions to these problems. They know that they're costly problems. They know that they're problems that disrupt their facilities, disrupt the opportunities for improving the prospects of other inmates to get out of prison in a way that they're going to be constructive in the future when they finally complete their prison terms. And so we need to address both of these areas, but I don't know that there's a mindset change that needs to take place here. It just is a recognition on the part of legislators that this is a problem and that it requires a concerted effort, part of which is our responsibility in the Judiciary Committee.
Interesting. Let me open up to all of you. Let's go right up here in the front, right here. Oh, we're going to bring you a microphone because millions are watching online right now. We can't hear you there. Is that not on? Great. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Goodlatte, for all of your work on criminal justice and also EB-5, by the way. We tried and we'll try again. Obviously, this is a very important and core civil rights issue. And we are working with Coke and in the right-left. There are 8 organizations, right and left, which I hate saying right and left, but that's what it is.
I'm going to encourage you to bring it to a question. So.
My question goes to voting rights. It is a core civil rights issue. We have seen people disenfranchised since the Supreme Court acted in 2013 to actually gut the Voting Rights Act. It is a bipartisan bill, and we hope you will hold hearings this year. Are you considering doing that, sir?
It's a little off the subject here. It is related to civil rights, but not necessarily criminal justice. But let me just say this. You are absolutely right. Voting is a critical, some would say the critical, civil right. I absolutely agree with that. But I don't disagree with the Supreme Court's decision with relation to the 11 states that had a pre-clearance requirement, and they said the evidence of discrimination in those states is very, very old, and unless you have new evidence of discrimination based upon race or other protected classes of people, there can no longer be this Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So we did hold a hearing on that very issue after the court made that decision, and we concluded, majority in the Judiciary Committee, that the Supreme Court's decision was correct, that there is still a pre-clearance requirement that can be imposed by the courts on an individual, community, or an entire state if they show new evidence of discrimination in availing themselves of the Voting Rights Act. One of the remedies that the judges can impose is a pre-clearance requirement. So we believe the law is very much intact in terms of protecting voting rights. Now, in addition, there are, you said, cases of people who are being denied their right to vote because of the Supreme Court decision. I don't believe that's the case at all. I believe that states do have the right to make sure that in addition to having access to the vote, that the vote can be trusted by the public. And so ballot security measures of various kinds have been adopted by states. Those also can be challenged in the courts if people feel that they are targeting groups of people, if people feel that they are unfair, and they can be struck down as well. And the state can then be put under preclearance if a court finds a particular state to be engaged in activities, including legislation that could lead to discrimination against people being able to exercise their right to vote. There's a definite debate about that, controversy about that, but I come down on the side of protecting people's right to vote as well as protecting the integrity of the ballot itself, because the public has to have trust that our voting systems are fair and honest.
Paul, did you have a comment, question? Paul Brown knows more about federal law enforcement than anybody in this room, maybe except the chairman, but Paul? Yeah? Microphone? Microphone? And now is a cool do at Notre Dame University.
Correct.
Yeah.
The NYPD, when I was there a couple of years ago, we had about 70,000 what we call EDP calls a year over the radio, emotionally disturbed persons. Those individuals were often armed and immediately dangerous either to members of the public or to the responding officers. You see critiques of police officers that they're not trained to deal with, psychologically disturbed or emotionally disturbed persons. Is there anything being considered about trying to fund what was, I think, anticipated was going to be kind of halfway houses, or when big institutions were closed for the mentally ill, that there be some kind of continuing support? Because right now in large cities, certainly in New York, many of these confrontations with the police that turn bad involve somebody who's off their meds and pose an immediate danger that don't lend itself to a counseling session.
Well, it's a very serious problem, and you make a very good point. So there's a number of different ways to address this. One is that when people go through the criminal justice system, as we've indicated, some of them have significant mental health issues. Many are not released directly from prison back into the public, but are released into halfway houses where they get an opportunity for supervision for a period of time before they're then released out on their own. But that doesn't address the person who either doesn't get into the criminal justice system or who has finished that process and are now out on their own, as you say, go off their meds and have a serious problem. And that's where Congressman Murphy's bill, I think, is very, very important, because while it is difficult to get to everybody that needs to get help, there needs to be an improved system to identify that somebody can call and get help for somebody else, or at least have somebody check on them before they get to that crisis point. And even when they do get to the crisis point, that they can make sure that when they are taken in, they get the kind of mental health commitment that they need. When I practiced law many years ago, before I became a member of Congress, I was appointed by the court to represent some of those people in mental health commitment hearings. And those hearings are very important. They're different in every state. In Virginia, they're designed to determine whether or not an individual is a danger to themselves or others. And if they are, they can be committed for inpatient treatment or outpatient treatment. And we need to absolutely utilize that system. And when they are committed, whether it's for inpatient or outpatient, because a judge has found them a danger to themselves or others, that's when the data should also go into the National Instant Check system to make sure that it is much more difficult for them to get access to firearms. But getting the help for them and getting them, as you would again say, back on their meds is a difficult thing to do that requires more than just the professionals in our communities, but every citizen. And we need to have laws that encourage that while still protecting people's privacy, but encourage that rather than ignoring that. And I think so often today we simply say, that's not my business, or I might get in trouble because I might be invading somebody else's privacy. And then you have some of these incidents that evolve into the tragedies that we've seen.
Thank you. Yes, right here. Peggy, okay. Fooled me. Peggy Orchowski.
I think this is Peggy Orchowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook and cover a lot about immigration. So criminal intent becomes really tricky when you talk about immigration violations. I think there's nothing more purposeful than someone who comes in illegally or overstays a visa. I've had many recent interviews lately with young blacks who are talking about, well, where's our sanctuary city? They feel that they are being, that it's unfair that most illegal immigrants get a buy. Of course, it's only a misdemeanor to be here illegally, but purposely purchasing and using false documents is a felony. And do you see any bipartisan movement at all to enforce immigration laws, and even with deportation, which is, of course, not a crime against humanity, but is a, fairly common
I know you rarely
enforcement
discuss
measure.
that topic.
How do you establish criminal intent?
Well, when you acquire documents that are forged, that right there is a felony, and it is easy to show the criminal intent there when you acquire documents that are not that are false about you or about somebody else. But there are also remedies here that do not necessarily involve the criminal process. So therefore, you don't have to worry about criminal intent. If somebody is not lawfully present in the United States, they can be removed from the United States, and you don't have to show whether or not they intended to be here lawfully. What they have to do is show that they are here lawfully, or they are eligible to be removed from the country. So I would say that similar to our gun laws, one of the biggest problems with the public's trust of our immigration system is enforcement of the law. And this is a difficult thing because we need to address a whole host of issues with regard to immigration, but I believe it starts with rebuilding the public's trust in the law and therefore greater enforcement. And I think sanctuary cities are a very, very misguided, unfortunate attempt to take the law into the hands of communities who may not agree with what current federal policy is. And it leads to tragedies like the shooting of Kate Steinle in San Francisco last year. That, to me, was a clear reflection of both failed federal and local policies, because this gentleman, if you can call him that, had been deported 5 times already, had been convicted of 5 felonies, some of which were the felonies of re-entering the country illegally after having been deported. And yet the federal government, knowing that San Francisco is a sanctuary city, instead of deporting him again, after he was being released, by the way, for a prison term for having entered the country illegally. So after he served his time, he's supposed to go back to his home country, but instead of doing that, they released him to a city where they knew that the likelihood was that they were going to release him onto the streets of San Francisco. I think San Francisco's crazy to have a policy that releases an individual like that onto the streets, where he then goes and kills an innocent young woman who just moved to San Francisco. It's a horrific tragedy, and people trying to take the law into their own hands rather than trying to build respect for the rule of law create circumstances like that.
Do you think that applies as well to cases like Judge Moore in Alabama and Kim Davis in Kentucky?
In what respect?
Of taking their law into their own hands, of ignoring or abrogating the contours of federal law?
Well, I think, again, when you are you talking about the display of the 10 Commandments by Judge Moore?
No, this is the case where he's basically issued orders not to issue same-sex marriage licenses.
Oh, okay. So I don't know that that's a violation of criminal law. It may be a violation of the oath that an individual
It's
takes.
just sort of in the same
to
ecosystem.
uphold the law. Well, I don't think it's the same ecosystem to the question of whether an individual has criminal intent when they violate a supposedly criminal law. But there are remedies for people who do not uphold the law, and those are followed in those cases.
Yes. And then up here.
Thanks. I wanted to ask.
Can you show us who you are?
I'm an associate editor here with The Atlantic, Claire Foran. And I wanted to ask.
I should know that, and I apologize, I don't.
Oh, no problem.
Welcome
I
to
just
our
started,
forum. Please
not
come
too
back
long
many
ago.
times. Go ahead.
So some advocates of criminal justice reform think that there may only be a small window, perhaps, before presidential politics start to kind of dominate what happens on Capitol Hill and the gears grind to a halt. So I was wondering if you also think that there's maybe sort of a window, perhaps at the beginning of this year, and if you're hoping that to maybe move quickly on passing criminal justice reform, if that's a concern, and also how much you're speaking with counterparts in the Senate about sort of moving legislation.
Good question.
Well, first of all, we are definitely speaking with counterparts in the Senate on the issue. Secondly, we want to move this as quickly as possible, but unlike some areas, quite frankly, there are bipartisan areas where after all the partisan debates that take place over choosing presidential candidates that we've been in, but we're entering into the even more intense time frame here as the Iowa caucuses come up soon and so on. Things that are truly bipartisan, where the members of Congress continue to, and again, the president will play a role in this too, continue to work together to try to get something done in a bipartisan fashion. I don't think there's a time limit on that, but I do want to get it done as quickly as possible.
Yes, right here.
Good morning. Nicole Austin Hillary with the Brennan Center. Chairman Goodlatte, thank you so much for your comments this morning, and I want to go back to the issue of mens rea. I appreciate your direct comments on that, but I do want to ask you, given that we are at such a crucial moment in terms of criminal justice reform, and I'm sure you know this, but I want to make clear, so many in the civil rights community do not think the mens rea issue should be included with the sentencing reform agenda. Do you have a willingness as a leader, and given this time that we are in, and given that many law enforcement leaders, many of whom are working with the Brennan Center, support criminal justice reform now, do you have a willingness to bifurcate those issues for the sake of us moving forward and trying to get sentencing reform done at this moment?
When we entered into this process, the first thing that we talked about was over-criminalization of federal law, the fact that we now have 5,000 federal criminal statutes, that nobody can know what the requirements are of all of those things as they go about their daily lives. And then to think of the hundreds of thousands of regulations that are built off of statutes that aren't even those criminal statutes, but for which they have imputed criminal liability. We all agreed in a bipartisan fashion, and members across the political spectrum, that this needed to be addressed. It is very important to many of us in the Congress, and it is more important to some in the Congress than some of the other reforms that are part of the whole criminal justice package. So I think it is absolutely critical that all of the elements of criminal justice reform that I described earlier be included in this process, or then the process will bog down and will fail and will get caught up in that kind of not just presidential debate, but all of the debate of all the people who listen to different voices and views. This is legislation that is comprehensive in its nature because we took so much time to listen to so many different concerns about criminal justice. And to me, at the very core of criminal justice is the requirement that somebody not go to prison if they did not have criminal intent. That is a fundamental element of doing criminal justice for me, and it is happening today, and it should not happen, and it has to be a part of the reforms that we do. So we are very committed to addressing concerns about making sure that there are not unfair results from any of the elements of this, whether it's sentencing reform, prison reform, or criminal intent mens rea reform. But I think they all have to go together because they all play a role in determining who winds up in our criminal justice system, who winds up in our prisons, and what the consequences are of that.
I want to apologize to you and to everyone who had their hands up there. I've gotten the hook out here and been told that we have a hard stop, but this is my second opportunity to interview the chairman. And I think in the first time we discussed a lot on patent reform, that was about 20% of the world. This is about 20%. So we've got about 3 more interviews left in us, is the way I see it. But you cover so much, and I want to thank you so much for your candor and for coming and spending time with us to talk to us this morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Steve.